Okay, let's jump to, well, we're burning, right? Jennifer Fielder is the CEO of the American Lands Council, a nationwide network of officials, resource experts, and public land users basically deeply committed to better use of federally controlled public lands. She's also a Montana state senator since 2012. Jennifer.
Thank you, Lord.
Hello, and thank you for having me today. I'm so glad to see a good turnout here this late in the afternoon. Thank you for being here. It's my pleasure to share this message with you. It's a little bit different than some of the other messages and the focus that you've been hearing, but we're going to talk about how to end megafires in the western United States, anywhere where the forest and rangelands are being mismanaged. My name is Jennifer Fielder. I do reside in the beautiful mountains of northwest Montana, and I am an active outdoors woman, and I utilize the public lands, as do my friends and neighbors and family, on a regular basis. I do serve in the Montana State Senate, and my Senate district includes millions of acres of federally controlled public lands, and there are some very serious problems with the way the federal land management model has been acting over the last several decades. The root of the problem begins with this map. Have you ever seen this map? Yeah. Good, then we're doing our job at the American Lands Council. This is a map of the United States, and the red represents all of the federally controlled lands in our country. These are the lands that are under the direct control of the federal government. It's over 50% of all the land in the western United States is controlled by Washington, D.C. Most of the people who make the decisions for those lands have never been there. Most of them don't represent areas that include these federal lands, so therefore addressing the issues is not a priority for them. And many just don't understand those issues. So this great imbalance is not only unfair and unconstitutional, it is not working. Here's a perfect example, and there are many that we could offer, but this one is a photograph of a forest that happens to be in Montana outside of our capital city of Helena, and there's a property line that divides the ownerships of this land. Can you guess which half of this forest is owned and managed by the federal government? The left half, that is correct. And the right half is owned and controlled locally. And the difference is not global warming. The difference is that the federally controlled side has been neglected. It is ripe with timber that is dead, diseased, and dying. It is at very high fire risk, and because of this neglect and mismanagement, it is a liability economically, socially, and environmentally. On the other hand, the right side is an actively managed forest. It is a healthy working forest. It has had some periodic logging throughout the years. It's a much lower fire risk because the forest has been thinned and there's not as much of a fuel load built up there. The trees are healthier. They have room to grow. They don't have to outcompete each other for water and nutrients and air and sunlight. And this land on the right is actually an asset economically, socially, and environmentally. This is a close-up picture of one of the typical untended national forests. It's dense, it's overgrown, it's unhealthy. Those trees are struggling to stay alive because they're choking each other out. There's too many trees on the landscape. And what we have there is basically a catastrophic wildfire waiting to happen. Now, why is this happening? I want to share with you an excerpt from one of the federal land management plans, and this is typical of the federal land management plans throughout the western United States, wherever there are federal lands. And this is a conclusion that they reached, an alternative they selected to govern our national forests for the next 20 years in northwest Montana and North Idaho. So keep in mind, this is the selective plan that this agency, the United States Forest Service, chose. And here's what their plan says. The selected alternative will limit our ability as resource managers to respond to fire, windthrow, insects and disease, and to provide timber or other commodities. The plan they chose thwarts the very reason for their existence. And the reason they used for shutting down the access and the activity on these lands in our area of northwest Montana and North Idaho was because they were trying to protect, they said they were trying to protect grizzly bears. Pick a species, any species, and where you see federal land, there'll be some kind of a species that's being utilized to shut down access and activity and proper management and beneficial utilization of the resources there. In this particular area, there was 2 grizzly bears that were studied that were used as the basis for the determination that we needed to remove roads in millions of acres of federal land. They studied 2 bears, a couple of mornings a week, a couple of hours per morning, and came up with their conclusion that grizzly bears avoid roads and therefore we need to remove roads. They completely ignored the data that was gathered, as shown in this aerial image, by 19 grizzly bears that had satellite collars on them, GPS collars, which track the movements of the bear 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. 19 bears. They completely ignored this data. We have tried to get them, the Interagency Grizzly Bear Committee, to actually use the current science and the best science. There's also DNA studies which have been done, hair snake samples and so forth, that provide much more data than they are using, but they continue to base the closures on the 2 bears, and it happened to be a mother and one of her young that they studied. And you can see here that where the bears are, this is the Swan Valley, just south of Glacier National Park and southeast of Flathead Lake. The bears spend most of their time in the actively populated areas where there's, and it's not real populated, it's the rural west, so populated means you might be able to see your neighbor's house. But the bears are spending their time there, down in the valley bottom where there are roads and there's logging, there's human activity. Very rarely do they spend their time up in the wilderness areas, the protected, unroaded areas. You can see their movements there. Yet these agencies are telling us that we have to close the land and remove the roads. So here's what they're doing. I mean, road restricted. At first they were saying non-motorized use is welcome, you just can't bring in motorized use. But then in the latest plans, they've actually gone to this obliteration agenda where they are completely obliterating roads, even to make them impassable to foot traffic. And that's actually in their plan, is that these roads must be made impassable to foot traffic. In the last 30 years, the federal government has eliminated literally thousands of miles of access roads. In Montana alone, we did a legislative study and found that they had eliminated 20,000 miles of roads on federal lands just in the state of Montana over the last 20 years. So that's a rate of 1,000 miles per year being either closed or obliterated. And the federal government has also reduced timber harvest by 70% over the last 30 years. This chart indicates the timber that's been harvested in the green. You can see the decreased harvest trends over a 20-year period, and then the increased areas that are burning over a 20-year period. There is a correlation there between the fuel load on the landscape and the number of acres burned. Now this graph here shows a 100-year period. It's approximately 100 years, and this is wildfires in the 11 western states over that period. And you can see in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, when there was active logging and grazing, the fires, the amount of acreage that was burning was fairly minimal. It was averaged about 500,000 acres a year. But these extreme different policies started to be enacted in the 70s and started to really take hold in the 80s and have a very adverse impact in the 90s and now into this century. And so what we see are now, instead of a normal year seeing about 500,000 acres burn, a normal year now is 7, 8, 9, even 10 million acres per year burning. It's not just the fuel load, that's not the only factor, of course. There are other factors, but a lot of those factors have to do with the way the federal government has been managing, or what we say, mismanaging the land. Grazing has also been in steep decline as ranchers are forced off of the landscape, sometimes for the most insane reasons. We've seen some ranchers recently locked up for practicing common range management practices. They were using controlled burn and back burn to prevent wildfire from causing damage, and they used regular range management fire, and they were actually cited as terrorists for burning federal property and locked up. President Trump did pardon them. Thank you, President Trump, for that. But this lack of vegetation management on federal lands is literally filling our air with toxic pollution. And the old normal in the rural West used to be these beautiful clear days in the summertime. And the new normal, this is a picture of the same spot. We have now smoke-filled toxic days that extend for weeks and months on end. And this is normal now. This is practically every summer that we have to deal with this and live with this type of poor air quality now in what was a beautiful part of our country. These fires are burning millions of animals alive. This one was lucky. She made it out. She's a bear cub that made it out. And she was nursed back to health and rehabilitated and released, but back into federal land, where the trees are so thick that all it takes is one lightning strike. And once fire gets going in conditions like that, unless you get on it quickly and put it out quickly, there's no stopping it. And for many, there's no escape, like this cow that was wedged between two trees while trying to outrun a wildfire. This beautiful buck couldn't outrun a wildfire. Neither could this mountain lion. And if these big animals aren't able to outrun the wildfire, what do you think is happening to all of the little ones? And as these federal fires build up, they gain momentum, and they blow hot air, and they carry flames onto adjacent private lands, destroying pets and livestock and people as well. Here's another example of one of the many problems with federal land management that we call bureaucrazy instead of bureaucracy. Montana has some of the best wildland firefighters in the world. We have 5 state helicopters that can go up. They carry 8-man teams. They carry more water, and they travel faster than the federally contracted helicopters do. Yet when we had several lightning starts a few summers ago, these puff balls of smoke in the mountains, and our state crews dispatched to go put them out while they were small and controllable, the federal government said, no, that's federal land, and your helicopters are not on our list of approved equipment. By the way, our teams have an unblemished safety record, perfect safety record. We put out fires on 70% of the state of Montana where they occur, because that's not federal land. 30% of Montana is under federal control, and they won't allow us to even put out these wildfires. And here's another example of bureaucrazy. Congress tried to address the problem a few years ago, and they passed the Farm Bill, and they came up with these imminent risk areas in each state, and Montana had 5 million acres designated as imminent risk, and these areas were going to receive priority treatment through the new Farm Bill. It was supposed to be the big solution to everything. Okay, so we had 5 million acres, and the federal agencies told us that with this new improved Farm Bill, they were going to be able to expedite treatment on 5,000 acres a year. And I'm sitting in a legislative hearing and listening to these bureaucrats tell us how great the Farm Bill is, and I said, wait a second, did you say 5,000 acres a year? And they said, yeah, and I got out my calculator, and I did a little math, and I went, well, it's going to take 1,000 years. That's how the federal government deals with an emergency. So why do we let this happen? I mean, don't we all want healthy air, water, and wildlife, and abundant outdoor recreation, and safe, vibrant communities? Who doesn't want that? We all want that. But distant, unaccountable bureaucrats and politicians in Washington, D.C. that aren't from the West, combined with the far-left extremist environmental hands-off, don't-touch policies, these have resulted in neglect, and neglect does not protect. Because our environment is not a museum, it's a garden, and if we tend it properly, it benefits man and nature alike. But increasingly, over the last several decades, and it doesn't matter which administration, which political party is in control, increasingly on federal lands, we have seen an increase in production of dirty air, polluted water, decimated wildlife, blocked access, and economically devastated, depressed, unsafe communities. I bring this message from one of these communities, and I'm glad you're here to hear it. But there is a solution. There's a better path for our public lands, and with the American Lands Council, we are leading the charge to get this done. And it's based on the simple premise that you tend to get better decisions when they are made by people closer to the subject matter.
Yes.
Because who knows and cares about the land and the water we drink and the air we breathe in the West than the people who live right there and work and play and raise their families in the West? Nobody cares more than the people who live close to the land. So it's time that we entrust our public lands to local management that cares. We are working on getting lands transferred from the federal government to the state governments and involving the people where the lands are located at a much greater degree than what we've been seeing over these last several decades. So some have challenged us and said, well, that's not constitutional, you can't do that. Well, it's very simple and it's very clear and it's undisputed. Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2 of the United States Constitution clearly grants Congress the power to dispose of, which means they can sell, they can transfer, they can convey, they can give it away, they can do whatever they want with property or territory belonging to the United States. And the other question is, do the states have a right to be treated equal? In this land of liberty and equality, do the states have a right to be treated equal? It's amazing we even have to ask or answer this question, but the answer is absolutely yes. And the subject of public lands was actually addressed by the Congress and the United States Supreme Court back in the 1920s and 30s. And we were able to dig this up out of a document that's published by Congress every few years. It's called the Constitution of the United States Annotated. And in the 1924 edition and the 1935 edition, it both references the Supreme Court rulings which address the question about states and control of the public land. And here is what the Supreme Court and the Congress published. They said the right of every new state to exercise all of the powers of government which belong to and may be exercised by the original states must remain unquestioned except for one thing, except so far as they are temporarily deprived of control of the public lands. The federal government was never meant to keep all these lands in our states forever and ever and ever. This was understood as statehood, but we've lost sight of it over the centuries. Has the transfer of public lands to states been done before? Absolutely, yes, it has. In fact, right now, in the western United States, the states there own and operate over 40 million acres of state-owned public lands, and they do a pretty good job of it. These lands are producing revenues that support our schools and our veterans' homes, and we don't have the wildfire issues. We don't have the conflict on the state lands that we're seeing on the federal lands. You can see this sign doesn't have any bullet holes in it. If you look at the earlier slide of the federal land, there was a few bullet holes in it, and that's pretty common too. Can states afford to keep it public? Absolutely yes. In fact, on average, when it comes to public land management, the western states are outperforming the federal government by 10 to 1 or better most of the time. And how do we free the lands? Here's how we get there. Number one, we encourage our president and his administration to do everything within their power to transfer management and regulatory authority to the states and the local governments. And we remember that whatever he does can be undone by the next administration. So what we need to do is be pursuing the final conclusion at the Supreme Court. And the state of Utah has been leading the effort in mounting a legal case to bring the question to the United States Supreme Court. And we believe that the ruling that will come down will require Congress to honor statehood equality and to extinguish federal title to the land. The court won't tell Congress how to do it, only that they must. And so the American Lands Council is working on a piece of federal legislation that would allow for the thoughtful, orderly transfer of certain federal lands to the states. And there's some caveats to this legislation that would make it work. So we don't have this wholesale transfer all at once. That would be rather chaotic. It would be a lot of responsibility all of a sudden for the states. So number one, the bill we're proposing would allow states to go at their own pace. They can acquire land as they're willing and able to accept new areas and manage them responsibly. Number two, any promises to keep it public must be upheld. So if the state declares what their purpose is for the land, they must declare what the purpose is for the land when they apply for the land, and then they must administer it for that purpose. So there's that discussion will happen in public through the legislative process. There's no bait and switch and backroom deals later with what the disposition of the land will be. States must coordinate with the counties where the land is located so the people there have a strong voice in the governance of the lands and resources. Any existing mineral rights, grazing rights, and water rights must be protected, and resource revenues would stay in the state and actually pay for the management of the lands and the facilities to keep them in proper condition. And finally, for those areas that are managed well, there will be excess revenues, and those can be shared between the state and local governments, so those state and local governments will be able to receive a boost from proper land management. Money does grow on trees, you just have to pick it.
Okay.
And the transfer of public lands to the states is the only solution big enough, and we need your help. We've got an exhibit out in the foyer. We'd love for you to join us. We aren't backed by any big industry. We are primarily a grassroots citizen, several elected officials, citizens and public land users that are working on this, and we'd love to invite you to join us and help us out. Thank you very much.